John Elkington, Chief Pollinator of Volans and long-standing advocate for sustainability and action on sustainable development. Thank you very much for an interview.
You're immensely welcome.
I'm very pleased to meet you, and I wanted to start, John, by asking you for a potted intellectual history of your thinking on sustainability over time, because you really are a luminary in our field, and I wonder how it all began for you and where you've got to now.
In a potted version. Well, I'll do a potted version, but it's quite a long story, and it started back in the 50s when, with my father and family, we travelled a great deal because he was a Battle of Britain pilot who stayed on in the Air Force after the war. And some of the experiences I had in different parts of the world had quite a profound impact on me. And when I was back in this country, aged 11, 61, I was at prep school and I found myself standing up and raising money for the WWF in its first year, not really understanding why I did it, but many years later, 1978, I co-founded a company, Environmental Data Services, with one of the founders of WWF, Max Nicholson, and through him I discovered why I'd sort of got onto that particular trajectory. But like for most of us, it's a multifactorial equation. And really it took off late 60s, early 70s with environmentalism. And I've worked alongside many NGOs, but always wanted to work with business. And some of that actually came from a fascination with technology, particularly aircraft in the early days, but then more broadly. And with ENDS, or Environmental Data Services, the idea was that we would engage business at a time when business was just not used to being approached by people from the environmental space, and immediately went on the defensive if that happened. But yet within 18 months, 2 years, we were helping companies like ICI back in the day, BP, write their first written environmental policy statement. So once companies were approached, it sometimes went relatively quickly, or in that case ICI's disappeared and BP is in great travail, so it's one wonders how much influence all this has. To cut a long story short, I mean, I in 1987 co-founded a company called Sustainability at a time when really nobody was using that term. Even in the Brundtland Commission report, it talked about sustainable development and sustainable, but not about sustainability. And that, for me, was always a slightly higher order principle. And so we literally found ourselves spelling the word for about 3 to 4 years. And then suddenly everyone seemed to know what it meant, but they meant infinitely various things when you sort of poke them on definitions. And I worked with sustainability for over 20 years, and we helped pioneer some of the emergent areas of business action, thinking and action in this space. So things like early stakeholder engagement back in the early 90s, early corporate environmental and then sustainability reporting. I was involved in sort of things like part of the founding group of the Global Reporting Initiative and so on. And we were very early into the boardroom. I mean, in the sense that for whatever reason, our style of approaching companies jumped the whole thing up the hierarchy, up the pecking order. So from about 30 years ago, I found myself fairly routinely in the boardroom, or what the Americans call the slightly down but C-suite level. So we had to make that up as we went along. And then 94 came up with the idea of the triple bottom line, 95 people, planet, profit. So one of the things I suppose I've done over time is seed new language, and in 1988 we published a book, The Green Consumer Guide, again, language that I come up with, and it sold 1 million copies in 18 months. So it's very odd. I mean, in a way, our positioning in the field is peculiar in the sense that we're not the organizations I set up haven't been standard consultancies, hired guns, to put it crudely, for clients. We've always had a very particular agenda of our own. I was once described as grit and the corporate oyster, which I quite liked. But then about 10 years ago, I started through the World Economic Forum and the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship and then the Skoll Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship to meet the new generation of social entrepreneurs, and got immensely excited with all of that. Tried to shift sustainability of the company into that space. Got a 3-year grant, $1 million grant from Skoll. But my colleagues at that time felt that was almost like they described it as a genius grant. I mean, as something that you got because of who you were rather than because it was an important field. Whereas I felt what people like Mohammed Yunus and Bunker Roy and others were doing was immensely interesting in terms of how you move towards different types of business models, really. So we set up Volans 9 years ago with people from the World Economic Forum and Schwab Foundation and from sustainability. And the idea has always been to keep it very, 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 very small. So we're currently 8 people that we're recruiting. And we work very deep into companies, and I can talk about that if you want. But more than that, we're trying to stretch this agenda and this whole sort of almost sustainability industry. You know, it's the 30th anniversary of the Brundtland Commission report this year, and I feel the next sort of 10 to 15 years are going to be immensely dangerous and challenging for the sustainability industry. It has to disrupt itself or it will be disrupted. And yet at the same time, the opportunities are off the scale bigger and more exciting than anything we've seen previously. So I'll stop there, but I think one of those, very easy to talk about tipping points and paradigm shifts and so on, but paradoxically I think Trump, to a lesser degree Brexit, are provoking a set of reactions from civil society which, if harnessed in the right way, I think could be immensely productive.
Thank you, John. That was extremely helpful and clear. Could we go into that a bit more then, and the challenges on the next 10 to 15 years? We've got the Sustainable Development Goals, we've got the Paris Agreement, we've got Mr. Trump, we've got political disruption. There's so many factors at play. Could you trace an optimistic scenario in which the sustainability cause effectively reinvents itself for this time and those sorts of paradigm shifts that you need to take place?
Well, it's funny, about 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, I was on an advisory board at the old CGB, Central Electricity Generating Board, at the time when it was coming out into the private sector. And I remember going to a power plant where they had at least a prototype fluidized bed reactor, and as you probably know, it's basically a bed of sand into which coal is fed, and if you try and push coal into sand, you can picture what happens, not very much. But if you put air through or oxygen through, the whole thing goes fluid, and coal can rush through and be burned in the presence of oxygen. And I think we're in one of those moments where our societies are moving from one order to another, and these things happen periodically. I went to university first time around to study economics, gave it up after 1 year. It seemed to have very little to do with what I was interested in. That year it was 1968. And but 2 economists always lived on in my memory. One was Nikolai Kondratiev, the other was Joseph Schumpeter, both saying the same thing: long wave economic cycles. You can dispute the periodicity, but I mean, probably 40 to 50 years. My sense is we're coming off a 5th long wave cycle. The World Economic Forum talks about 4th Industrial Revolution. I think we're coming out of a 5th wave going into a 6th. But the 5th one has set the preconditions of the 6th, so the 5th one was very much about IT in all of its sort of iterations: hardware, software, internet, and so on. And the 6th one will be around a whole bunch of new industries, technologies and so on, which totally depend on the availability of data and so on. So things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, Internet of Everything, synthetic biology, all of these things feed on data. So the 6th wave will be built around that, and the issues will be quite different. We already see some evidence of that around, autonomous trucks, where people are talking about 1.7 million jobs going in the United States in relatively quick order in terms of the societal adaptation curve. So to your question, can I paint a positive scenario? I think we are in a phenomenally interesting and phenomenally dangerous period, because every time one of these transitions happen between one set of technologies and another, or one economic long wave cycle and the next, things go wobbly. So you couldn't predict Trump, you couldn't predict Brexit, or populism or whatever, but that's exactly the sort of wider societal response you could well expect, if not predict. And my hunch is that these, I mean, based on historic experience, these periods take about 12 to 15 years to crank through. We're several years into it, so I mean, who knows how long this is going to take, but there's an accelerative function in these waves where they're getting shorter, and the periods between them are getting shorter too. The way I see it in terms of the positivity piece is that our species tends to do very, very little, and that might be on obesity and chronic diseases like diabetes, or it might be on the risk of antibiotic resistance, or it might be on climate change or whatever. But it does very little until it's backed into a corner and has no option but to do something. And I think we've backed ourselves, or backing ourselves, into the mother of all corners, where we either act or the costs are going to be off the scale. Awful. So that's the downside, but the upside is, I think, that will trigger responses, political, often led by business now, because business sees the risks and the opportunities. And there's a rising generation in business, as we both know. And when I compare it to sort of 30, 40 years ago, when I first started to approach companies, I mean, you would be very lucky to meet a lawyer or a public relations person. Now it's straight through to the boardroom, because these people understand that, and if they don't understand, they're getting it from their insurers and reinsurers and others in the sort of wider ecosystem. So I think it's a very exciting time, and I find it relatively easy to sketch a positive trajectory, but I think it has massive implications for the sustainability industry, which I think is not fit for purpose in what comes next.
Thank you, John. In the book, I want to write about examples where companies are already doing great things, whether it's to address climate change or to have a more harmonious relationship with the natural environment. I've interviewed Paul Polman. I want to write about what Unilever are doing, but I'd love it if you could sort of unpick, 1, 2, 3 case studies of where, with Volans' help, companies are thinking in deeply about sustainability and doing new things which they otherwise might not have done.
Well, it's interesting you mention Unilever, which is in a sense the defining. I might just shut the door.
Yeah, do. You have a happy. It is indeed amazing.
So yes, you mentioned Unilever and St. Paul Pullman, and in a way my working, and I'll just very quickly sketch my working relationship with Unilever, because in a way I think it and then I'll go on to 2 or 3 other cases. I first came across Unilever professionally, actually working with them in the mid-1980s, when the chairman of the Swiss and Italian business, the lever side of the business, engaged me to sort of come in and help persuade the Unilever board to pay more attention to environmental issues. And I told him at the time we were writing this thing called the Green Consumer Guide, and when it came, and we found it very difficult at that stage to move the board of Unilever. The book came out, and within 3 weeks, quite literally, I mean, we had 12 big stories in the Financial Times in 3 months around the book, and Procter & Gamble hove in view, and they basically said, we want to work with, at that time, sustainability, which is very early stage of that, just in its first year. Want to work with sustainability, director level, over many years, and incidentally, we don't want you working with any part of Unilever. It was the first time that this became competitively sensitive in a way. And then I worked so for quite a number of years, about 12, 13, we largely worked with P&G. But periodically and increasingly over time, we started to do more work with them. And when they bought Ben & Jerry's, I was at a board meeting of Ben & Jerry's where the decision was being made whether to sell, and if so, to whom. But we were whacked in the middle of the board meeting. It was off the coast of Georgia. US, and Hurricane Floyd hit, so I think this was 1999. So we all had to sort of scamper back to the coast, and then this huge, great sort of gone with the wind exodus from the coast back to Atlanta and so on. But I was written into the contract, the sale of Ben & Jerry's to Unilever as a guarantor of their values. The Securities and Exchange Commission in the US then struck that out as illegal, but we tried. Then Unilever said, well, that was interesting, and then they didn't entirely succeed with their absorption of Ben & Jerry's. It wasn't entirely a happy story. So they then set up a venture, or they put $100 million, I think, into a venture capital fund called Physic Ventures in San Francisco, run by a friend, Will Rosenzweig. And I was on the advisory board there for, I think, 3 years. And that was an attempt of Unilever to say, if when we pull innovative companies in, we tend to suffocate them, is there a way that we can hold the process further out and incubate it remotely, and in a way where if PepsiCo decide to buy a company, we're moderately comfortable with that as long as we get first refusal. So I worked with them on that. And then we worked on a genetic engineering project for 3 years, which was including things like wargaming, which was around the introduction of a novel protein into particularly ice creams and frozen foods, which stopped freezing, creating structural damage in foods. And the original protein came from fish, the Arctic char, so the North Pole. And they cloned the gene into the yeast genome and produced it that way. And they were very nervous, particularly because many of these foods are eaten by children, that there would be intense pushback. As they found, there wasn't. And in fact, in many countries like China or the States, that wasn't an issue at all. Europe, potentially more of an issue, but because of the way they handled it, it went reasonably well. So in different ways, we've sort of cross-connected with Unilever in many different ways. I think it's very dangerous that at times we put all of our eggs in one corporate basket. So I think at the moment, Unilever is got this sort of wonderful halo around it. In the same way that if back in the day the Body Shop would have done, and we see where they are now with L'Oreal and so on, or Interface. Interface an odd one because they've gone through the GlobeScan rankings over 14 years, always consistently in the top 8 or 10 companies as rated by experts, and now going through a really quite wonderful, the Climate Take Back initiative that they're launching, sort of reinvigoration in a way. So if I give you a case study or two, I mean, most of them have that sort of characteristic, which is that a lot of the companies that we work with, one way or another, we've worked with for a very long time. So another one that we're working with at the moment is called Covestro. They're IPOing out of the Bayer Group. So they used to be called Biomaterial Science. They were the third biggest business within the Bayer Group. And their CEO, Patrick Thomas, who happens to be British, although it's a German company, obviously, describes the business as an 80-year-old, 12 billion euros a year, 16,000 or 17,000 employee startup. So he's trying to sort of get a pretty established materials business to embrace sustainability and come at things very differently. A couple of years ago, he and their chief sustainability officer, Richard Northcote, and I were sitting down thinking, what's next? Because in a way, with that company about 5 or 6 years ago, Patrick, the CEO, invited a colleague and I to go and spend a day with about 12 or 15 of their more technical people, product development people and so on. And it was almost like a dragon's den. These people through the day presented what they were doing. At the end of which I said, and I think in public, that was fascinating. I mean, I'm nosy, I'd love to hear what you're all doing. But it really doesn't add up. It's not even the sum of the parts, let alone greater than. And the reason is that all of these things are siloed and in some ways almost sort of cut across each other. So some years afterwards, we were thinking, so what could be the common language here? And something that Patrick had said to me quite some time ago was that if you take a unit of carbon and you invest it in a polyurethane foamed insulation panel for a building or whatever, over the lifetime of that panel, you will get a 70-fold return on the carbon invested. So I was saying, wouldn't it be interesting if, and I thought this was novel, it wasn't, McKinsey had come up with a paper in 2008 on carbon productivity. And I said, wouldn't it be interesting to sort of, at a time when we're demonizing carbon, and Bill McDonough talks about fugitive living and durable carboners, the fugitive stuff up there that we're increasingly anxious about. Wouldn't it be interesting if we came at this differently, in a more creative spirit, and through thinking about carbon budgets, thinking about carbon increasingly as a scarce resource, and a magical resource, really, think about nanotechnology and so on. And they jumped on that, and so now we're doing quite a big project with them, I think the biggest one we've ever done, and one part of that will be, there's a blurring going on, because at the same time, another company I've worked with since the late 80s is Novo Nordisk in Denmark. And Lisa Kingo, who's been a long-time colleague there, now runs the Global Compact and has brought us in to the Global Compact, basically saying 15, 16 years of the Compact, great as far as it went, but a lot of it's still tick box. How do we jump those 9,000 companies, or at least a leadership group among them, and then cascade that through the bigger group of companies into a very different framing of what we're trying to do here, which is system change. And we've talked for 5 years now of breakthrough innovation, breakthrough leadership, and so on. Global Compact is now embracing that breakthrough language and agenda, and next year we'll launch. That'll be core to what they will be doing. And building up to that, in September in New York, we have everything's a summit these days, but a breakthrough leadership summit with the Compact, 500 of their key people, and building up towards that, we're doing a series of base camps. So we've got one in June on carbon productivity, and Covestro are backing that. But for example, we've got Paul Hawken, who's done Project Drawdown.
Yes, very interesting.
Coming across.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating. And so he's going to keynote, and we have Interface coming as well. But then a bunch of other intriguing people. And the reason I go through all of that is that there's a blurring between the work that we're doing for Global Compact, which is how do you take a platform and make it future fit, and the Covestro work, which is how do you take a company that is in materials and create a runway for breakthrough innovation for them, which would take them beyond the moment where Patrick and Richard, the CEO and CSO, leave the company, which will happen in the next few years, and make it absolutely integral to what they're doing. And so they're funding in a big way the carbon productivity base camp. So again, I go back to Patrick, and I've worked with him again since the late 80s, and he was at ICI Polyurethanes. Now that isn't always the case, and I just concluded one more case study, which again is a very big company, and most of the companies that we work with that pay, and we work with a lot that don't, or give us shares, which probably will never be worth anything, but the bigger ones are the ones that pay. And Nestle is a company we've been working with for about 7 years now, I think, 8 years. And actually 9 years. It was really weird because twice I had very public altercations almost with the then CEO, then chairman, now chairman emeritus of Nestle, Peter Brabeck-Letmathe. And the first one was at Davos, and he did a speech at a breakfast meeting, and I asked the first question, which was very friendly, but barbed, and he responded brilliantly. But John Humphreys was in the chair, and through his earpiece, Infosys, who were the host, said to John, shut it down. If that's the first question, God knows what the next one is going to be. And yet Peter had done really, really well. There were 100 people in the room, so it was quite a surprise that they shut it down. And the second time was about 7, 8 months later. It's London Business School. And there were 3 of us on a panel, a couple hundred people in the room. I'm partly going through this because it illustrates where we are in the landscape, and I think Jonathan Porritt would be close to this as well, where I spoke first, then Peter started to speak, and partway through what he was saying, he said that something was just clinically wrong, not willfully lying, but just wrong. And you think, what do I do? Do I sort of wait until he's finished and everyone's forgotten, or do I just reach out and touch him on the elbow and say, instantly, Peter, that's wrong, which I did. And he's, slightly surprised, but said, tell me why, and then responded really, really well. And then a couple of his people in the audience literally ran up afterwards and said, Mr. Brabeck does not like being treated like that. I said, look, I think he responded really well, and I imagine the audience would actually thought better of him for the way he came back on that particular question. 2-3 months later, I got a call from Peter himself saying, would you join an advisory board? And I said no, because this is what the system always does. It's a challenge from the outside, and it either tries to kill the nuisance or it pulls it in close to the corporate chest and suffocates it. And that's pretty much exactly what I said. He said, but that's why. And I said, we have publicly resigned relationships with companies. We have resigned relationships, and on occasion we've done it publicly. And I think this would be a very high likelihood for that happening. And he said, but that's why we want you inside. And so I said, well, who else is going to be on the advisory board? So he said, Michael Porter, C.K. Brahalad, before he died, this one, Sarah Gelden, some extraordinary people who I admire immensely from a safe distance. So I said, well, I'll give it a go. And that's 8-9 years later, I'm still in, and that's taken me to Colombia and Indonesia and Ivory Coast and so on. It's been absolutely fascinating, but it's been at times, I think Peter at times has almost set me up like an attack dog with Michael Porter, in the sense that Michael and Mark Kramer have had this great success with shared value. Shared value came out of Nestle in the first place. They've always talked about creating shared value. Michael and Mark did a case study, then this wider campaign came. And I've always felt nervous about shared value. I think it's brilliant as far as it goes, but I think it doesn't go nearly far enough to deliver system change, because it's win-win. And a lot of what we're talking about, you think about coal and the Appalachians or whatever, it's a win for the climate, but a catastrophic loss for the local communities or companies like Peabody Coal or whatever. So I've been sort of trying to keep that point on the agenda. And for 18 months, Nestle, Peter used me, I think, just to sort of almost fight this out in public. It was very well mannered and the rest of it. And the end of it, and this little tiny, minuscule achievement, Nestle, instead of saying we do shared value and that embraces everything, said we do shared value and sustainability. And it's a tiny thing, but it's reflective of the fact that there had been a shift in their framing, all of that, and that prefigured what we're now doing in the breakthrough space. But
thank you, John. They're really helpful case studies. I shall write those up.
Just one very quick thing,
please
which
do,
is that one of the things that we've always done is to encourage companies to take risks, and sometimes those risks backfire. And I mentioned, for example, Novo Nordisk. And, Bill Ford, I worked with Bill Ford for a number of years, about 12, 15 years ago. And we got him to do their first ever sustainability report. And it blew up in their faces, because I did an interview with him, and it was about 3 to 4 pages in the front of the report. And he basically said that he was worried about sport utility vehicles. He felt that they were unsustainable. At the time, I think they were making something like $14,000 profit on each SUV and cents on their compact. So it was clear why they stuck with SUVs. And for a couple of days, unhappily in a way, I was in Australia when it broke loose, but he got absolutely pilloried, I think, the New York Times. And then it went positive. But every so often we've steered companies into things that are almost a risk too far. And with Novo Nordisk, but again back in the early 90s, we had a group of Greenpeace-like 12 stakeholders in Novo Nordisk on the day when they had an accidental spill of genetically engineered organisms from a plant in the heart of Copenhagen. You couldn't have scripted a worse scenario. But it's interesting, if a company responds well in those circumstances, the wider world sometimes learns a lot about the culture individuals, and it certainly happened in that case. So all I'm saying is that none of this is a straight line trajectory, and every so often we screw up royally, and it's something we try and provide as a public health warning to potential clients before we get involved.
Thank you, John. And one of your recent reports, which I think you did for this Business and Sustainable Development Commission, argues that businesses should be exponentially more social, lean, integrated and circular.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask if you could describe that, because it's quite a compelling proposition.
Well, again, if I'm trying to explain it to somebody outside the field, I would tend to say that 30 or 40 years ago, I was trying to bring NGOs like Greenpeace into the business world and into corporate boardrooms at a time when certainly the people in boardrooms wanted to have no truck with environmentalists, and ditto most people in groups like Greenpeace, but relatively quickly that the bridges were built and sometimes served a useful function. 12 to 15 years it was trying to do the same thing, but this time bridging between the world of social innovators, social entrepreneurs, impact investors as we now call them, and mainstream business. And again, that different because the social entrepreneurs really wanted to work with big business but didn't know how, whereas the NGOs were much more skeptical. And now, so for example, in August we're taking 20 people from companies that are members of the Global Compact to Singularity University in California to expose them to some of the sort of exponential mindset stuff, exponential organizations, business models, technologies, and all the rest of it. And the reason why we're doing that is not saying that NGOs are no longer important. Of course they are. I think they're crucial, but they need to reinvent themselves in some key respects. Social entrepreneurs are fabulous insofar as they go, but a lot of their social, I was about to say social work, but social market outcomes are not scalable in the same way that many of the people who funded them, like Bill Gates or Jeff Skoll, originally had hoped. So I'm really interested in the exponential folk, and for two reasons. One is they're beginning to talk in terms of, well, Singularity University talking about global challenges, 12 of those. They map very directly onto the Sustainable Development Goals, but these are separate universes, really. And late last year we got Singularity University onto a panel at the Private Sector Forum in New York, UN Private Sector Forum. And afterwards, a couple of people from companies who I knew quite well came up to me and said, why have we got Nick Hahn, the guy who came, and Singularity University here? Don't understand that at all. I really don't see the natural fit. And I said, well, you just said exactly the same 30 years ago with NGOs. You just said the same 10, 15 years ago around people like Muhammad Yunus. And there's no guarantee that this is going to go up the same trajectory. But unless we do, we're in effect screwed, because the Sustainable Development Goals, even if you take them out to a 2050 horizon, are an exponential agenda. I mean, getting to zero or no, whether it's hunger or poverty or whatever, in any sort of time scale, suggests exponential forms of change. So who's best at doing that? And the answer is, it's people. Now, I've been talking about Elon Musk for over 10 years. I've been talking about the X Prize Foundation for I don't know, since they were founded, well over 12 years, and for most of that time people hadn't heard of them. We've just appointed the chief scientist to the X Prize Foundation to our board, because we feel that style of thinking, you know about challenge prizes and so on.
Yes, indeed.
And one of the ones that they're doing smack bang in the space that we're going at with Covestro and the Global Compact is their Carbon X Prize. And so part of what we're trying to do now is one of the problems that this whole space has is that people can now see the opportunities. Everyone wants to stake their claim. I mean, it was already a busy, fragmented, internally competitive industry, and it's becoming worse in many ways. So what we're trying to do is to say to Covestro, it's going to be really great if you have Interface on the same stage and even ahead of you, and to Paul Hawken, if we can get some other people like X Prize there who are doing complementary stuff, but maybe some people would see that as competing for oxygen. I don't. We've got to build much larger consortiums, and we're forced to do that in a way because we're very small by design. And so the Global Compact work is being done by a consortium of 6 organizations. Covestro work is being done by, again, a consortium of about 5 or 6 organizations, with us holding the core each time. And I've completely forgotten what your original question was.
No, that was fine. It was just to ask about this report and
Oh, yes.
and whether a business, and you answered it, but I mean...
Well, not indirectly.
I mean, this model, the businesses of the future which are meeting the SDGs must be social, lean, integrated and circular, and must integrate sustainability considerations right into their core.
Well, what I went off at a tangent, which I quite often do, and the tangent was around people who are thinking exponentially are also beginning to think about sustainable development goal-like objectives.
Yes, yeah.
The other piece is that if you talk to these people, and we've been going to Silicon Valley a certain amount recently, what you find is you ask them about, so who are you talking to in the sustainability world? And the answer is almost always nobody.
Yeah.
These are worlds. So in many ways, the sustainability world is looking backwards. We're looking back at the industries that defined and drove earlier waves, economic waves, like oil, petrochemicals, automotive, aerospace. We're not directly plunged, and there are exceptions to every rule. And I think their Forum, for example, have their Singapore base. So there are people trying to do that, but it's not nearly at the scale yet that it would need to be. So this Breakthrough Business Models report, Jeremy Oppenheim, leading that the commission work, came to us and said, "Will we do that report?" And I think he was pleased with what we did, but I equally think he was shocked by the long waves analysis in the heart of it, because I don't think he believes in that stuff. But I don't think it's a matter of belief. I think that the evidence suggests that there are these periods of investment and disinvestment. And on Friday of last week, I went down to Lewis to have dinner with a woman called Carlota Perez.
Yes, at the LSE.
Yes,
I don't know her,
Centennial Professor as was. And because there seemed to be a difference between her tracking and mapping of long waves and ours. And during the dinner, it became quite clear what was happening, because we're talking about a 5th IT wave and a 6th with all of these other things. And she's talking about a period of installation where you get something like the railroads installed, or electricity grids, or the internet, and then a period of deployment. And for her, we've been going through the installation period through that IT era, and we're now into deployment, which is exactly what. So we're going to be awash in data, and that's feeding all of the technologies I went through, from mechanical learning to synthetic biology. So it turns out that we're on the same page, but just looking at things slightly differently. So I think there are still a lot of people who don't like that sense of that there are, the economy almost breathes. It has these patterns of going up and down and in and out. And what makes me optimistic is if we are even halfway right, that we're the old order is discombobulating, and the new one is struggling to be born, and we can find ways to play into that new space, we can have quite disproportionate levels of impact. Although afterwards, if you go look back from 2050s, trying to disentangle what the sustainability industry did, or what just became sort of the new normality, common sense, I think will be quite difficult.
Should we be very hopeful about what Elon Musk achieves on storage and the like, and are there others like him behind the scenes?
There are others like him, but he's one of these creatures like Henry Ford, or perhaps more Thomas Edison, somebody who straddles, as you know, industries, breaks silos. And a lot of people look at him, and sometimes, like Tesla buying Solar City, this Solar City has problems, let's just buy them up from the slightly better endowed companies. But when he then starts to sort of talk about the different tile categories that he's about to launch, and you see the integration that's driving what he does. I'll come back to the question, but one of the things, I resigned from the GRI some years ago, board, and from the International Integrated Reporting Council at the same time. in both cases for the same reason, which is that I think I'm all for integration. But I think both of those initiatives are integrating horizontally, by which I mean across multiple capitals and streams of activity. What they're not doing, what I encouraged particularly IRC to do but couldn't get them to move, was we need to integrate vertically as well and over time. And by that I mean we need data flows and intelligence that move from the field, the farm, the fishery, factory, right the way through supply chains up to the biosphere, the atmosphere, the oceans. And at the moment we can't do that. So to your question, who else is out there? One of the most interesting groups, now bought by Google, but that we visited last year in San Francisco, is called Planet Labs, or Planet. I don't know whether you've come across them. They're a satellite group. So we went to visit them, and it's an old, what was originally an old warehouse, I think. And they were manufacturing, normally you'd see satellites being in almost pharmaceutical level conditions and of hygiene and all the rest of it. And this was just behind a plastic curtain. And
really,
people
yes.
sort of, in there. And these satellites are the size of about 3 times the size of a sort of shoebox or something, maybe 4 or 5. And they put flocks of them up. They call them doves, and they almost kick them out of the space station. And then they configure them, and they use, and the technology they're using is iPhone technology for cameras and so on. And then they use software to almost create a compound eye and treat the data in different ways. And the purpose is to democratize satellite imagery and satellite data and so on, so that we can better manage our planet. So Elon Musk is somebody who uniquely at the moment successfully straddles obviously space and solar and the car space. But the fact that they've now crossed over with Ford in terms of valuation may be a momentary blip, but I think it suggests that the financial markets are basically seeing electric vehicles as the future, which when he started simply was not the case. So I think he's a mutation. He's really unusual, but at the same time, he's encouraging a generation of people to think like him and behave like him. And if he continues to succeed, more or less, then I think the financial markets will be more inclined to back people doing these more disruptive things. But I want him to succeed, partly because I think the Teslas are, I've only once driven one, and it was on a gravel thing, gravel around an old Viennese castle, so you couldn't go very fast. But my God, they're extraordinary cars. I would never buy one. I want to do without cars entirely. But and in that sense, it's encouraging us to sort of put in the smart grid recharging things, which have many other applications. But public transit has to be, and also the designing of cities to minimise the need for travel and so on. There are a bunch of other things that we should be thinking on. It's very easy to be seduced by lovely shiny bits of metal.
Well, John, thank you. This has been very inspiring and informative. And my last question, which I've asked everybody, is how optimistic are you? And do you think we can do this over the next 10, 15, 20 plus years?
How optimistic are you?
Well, on my best days, I'm very optimistic.
Yeah.
I'm about to become a father in the next few days.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much, John. And so I feel sort of duty to be optimistic, and to I feel humanity, if we apply the best of our minds and our hearts and our rational brain and so on, we can do this. On the other hand, I behold the world and Syria and the current challenges of our time, the humanitarian crisis, and I feel very upset. So I don't know, I oscillate between the two all the time, but I feel we have a duty to throw everything at it. But I wonder, for those who've watched this story over the last 40 years, plus 50 years.
No, I'm pleased I asked the question first, but for all sorts of reasons. But some of my younger colleagues sometimes say that I sound like an Old Testament prophet, because I genuinely believe, I'm horrified by the thought, but I think we will have a major war within the next 10 to 15 years. And it's partly because my favourite subject has always been history. And if you look back through history, again, it's much rougher than with economies, but there's a periodicity. And it seems to be that if you have 2 generations from a major war, people forget what it was like, and they forget what leads up to it. And that includes our leaders, not just the people who are going to potentially be called upon to fight it. So I think we are much closer in to, and in some ways I see a similarity between the Spanish Civil War and the Syrian Civil War. And I was in Syria, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, absolutely adored the country.
It's wonderful.
Had my genomics done about 3-4 years ago, and it turns out, as I went around Syria, people would come up to me and recognise me. It happened 5 or 6 times, quite extraordinary. But they didn't know me, and it wasn't. It wasn't. They didn't know anything about me. It was something about facial structure or whatever, and I was with a group, and everyone commented on it. But when I had the genetics done, my
You've got
genes come
Syria.
from
Right.
Mesopotamia,
Okay.
some time back in history. So I can sound like an Old Testament prophet in the sense that I also think that probably what will drive us finally towards a reinvigorated UN or something like will be a global pandemic. And we've teetered on the edge of it periodically with SARS and avian flu and so on. But I've talked to people at WHO and so on. We are so close into that. Even if somebody doesn't actually do it, I mean, sort of release a genetically modified organism, which I think is also much more likely than people might imagine. So at that level, I suppose it's a form of realism in the sense that you wouldn't choose to be on this planet with this particular species at this point in its development if you knew what was coming. But at the same time, I think that our chances of using some of those disruptions to drive truly systemic change are way bigger than they've been at any point during the evolution of the environmental movement, which I've been privileged to sort of pretty much grow up with. But for that to happen, I just go back to the point that I think we've got to think exponentially and operate exponentially at a time when most people who have been raised as environmentalists in a way hate anything that's exponential, because that anything that behaves like that is very dangerous, and yet. So simple answer, I'm broadly optimistic. I have down days, I have cycles of despond. But I just love this space, and I love the caliber and the quality and the enthusiasm and the energy of people who are drawn into this space. And each year I'm visiting professor at 3 universities, and I've just done in this last month annual lectures that I do at UCL and Imperial. I just come away so recharged, hoping that a number of those people come and do projects here. So yeah,
Thank you, John.
optimistic.
Well, very grateful to you for the interview, and lovely to meet you. And
The same.
all the best wishes for your work in the future.